So let's start talking about the anatomy of the saw. The most important part, obviously, is the blade area. So when we're talking about the blade area, we're talking about basically everything in here. So we've got, obviously, the main blade, which is a 12-inch blade. We have a riving knife, scoring blade, and we have the blade plate, which is this black insert here. Now, the most important part of this assembly is the riving knife. The riving knife is your primary safety device on the table saw. It's what prevents material from passing over the blade at the back. It prevents material from pinching onto the blade. We don't really have any situation where you'd be using the saw and not running it with a riving knife installed. The Australian standard for riving knives is no lower than 13 millimeters below the top tooth of the blade, and no further than 3 to 13 millimeters between the blade and the knife itself. So long as the riving knife is positioned there and in line with the blade, it's good. So we have the main blade here, and we have the scribing blade here. The scribing blade, as we've discussed previously, rotates in the opposite direction to the main blade. Let's talk about the scoring blade on this saw for a little bit. So the scoring blade is this little blade in the front that runs in the counter rotation to the main blade. There's 3 holes in the table surface here. These 2 are for tuning the scribing blade to make sure that it is angled in line with the main blade, and really for most users you never need to touch it. This one here is an Allen key that lets you raise and lower the scribing blade. This is the one that you'll be interacting with, and it's only accessible when the blade's in a 90-degree position. So what's the scribing blade for? A scribing blade is for cutting melamines or laminate materials like this. So what happens is the scribing blade will come up and it will make a cut this way into the bottom laminate of the material, which means that when the main blade comes in and cuts through, it will come through the top surface, make a clean cut on the top laminate, and then it won't chip out the bottom laminate because it's already been cut. So it's not pulling through from the behind and like tearing out that laminate, so you get a nice clean edge on both sides of your board. That's what the scoring blade's for, and unless you're using a laminate, you don't need it for any other material. With the scribing blade, the mechanism is basically just a screw and a bolt that raises a lever. So as you're lowering the blade, sometimes it's necessary to just push on the arbor to make sure the blade's fully below the surface. When raising the blade, you really only need to have it as high as the laminate that you're cutting. So typically that means something like 0.1 to 0.5 of a mil above the surface of the table. We have a depth gauge that helps you set that. One of the things that we see people do a lot of the time that's really dangerous, and we try and just be very clear that this is an important safety rule with this saw, is people will often set up their cut before they've turned the saw on, and they'll place their material down and they'll place it here. And this is covering the scribing blade, but it's pre the main blade. And that's actually really dangerous because the scribing blade, because it rotates in the opposite direction, will, if it's just a little bit high, pull that thing forward into the main blade, bad things will happen. So whenever you're setting up your material and whenever you're setting up for a cut, you always start before the blade plate, which is this black insert here. As long as you're before the blade plate, you are before the blade assembly, and that's perfectly safe. So all your cuts need to start back here. So here we have the handle for the sliding table, stop or the lock for the sliding table, which you need to pull out, rotate 90 degrees to keep it open, and then you can move the slide, and then you can pull it out, rotate it back for it to lock in. We have the sliding table itself. We have the sliding table extension, which is the white arm frame that comes out from the sliding table. The sliding table fence. The sliding table fence has 2 stops that you can move around on it and flip on and off. And it has a clamp, which is useful for holding down the corner of large material. Locks for the extension on the sliding table, which hold the extension in place. Underneath the table, you'll find both the main lock and the angle lock that holds the fence in place.